Hey guys, welcome into the 14. I'm Nick Cole, and we're breaking down all Week 5's SEC football betting matchups. Today, we're talking about the Auburn Tigers visiting the LSU Tigers on Saturday night at 9 p.m. Eastern at Tiger Stadium in Baton Rouge. That game's going to be on ESPN. The line for this game opened as LSU is a 4-point favorite, and it's moved slightly as the Tigers are a 3.5-point favorite at the time of this recording. The over-under is held firm at 55.5. I'm going to bring in our betting analyst, Christopher Smith. Christopher, what are you thinking about this usually well-anticipated SEC West rivalry game?
Well, my lock of the week for the entire SEC is that the losing fan base of this game is going to be very angry at the head coach who lost the game. So we'll get into the betting notes pretty soon here. But first, why don't we get into Nick's news and notes and take us through the headlines around these two programs?
Sure. So let's start with some weather and injuries. On the weather side of things, since it's such a late kickoff in Baton Rouge, we should have some pretty mild temperatures in the low to mid 70s around the kick. And there may be some rain in the forecast. So watch for that. But the wind forecast doesn't look too bad. So we shouldn't see too much messing with this track for the game. On an injury standpoint, the Tigers left tackle, LSU Tigers left tackle, Cameron Wire is finally ready to play after missing the majority of the beginning of the season there. And probably the player that we're most worried about in this game is their star defensive back, Derek Stingley Jr. He missed last week's game against Mississippi State, which the LSU ended up winning without him. But he may or may not be able to play in this game. And it'll be a big factor whether they have him involved to stop the Auburn passing game. And then on the Auburn side of things, linebacker Owen Popo missed Saturday's game. But it seems like that, maybe they were holding him out against Georgia State, thinking they could get by without him and let him get back and get right. I think they'll probably have him on Saturday night. They barely beat Georgia State last week. And I know the final score was 34-24, but if you were watching that game, they were within one play late in the fourth quarter as a miracle fourth down touchdown pass of losing that game. They scored on that touchdown pass, then made a pick six to sort of make the score look a little more lopsided than it was. But Georgia State controlled most of that game, and it was very alarming, especially after watching Auburn look really good in two easy wins in the non-conference schedule, and then look good at Happy Valley when they went up and narrowly lost to Penn State in week 3. So a little bit confusing to see them go through that. Maybe just a little bit of a look-ahead spot, knowing that the SEC conference slate started in week 5, coming off of that loss against Penn State, and it's kind of that Valley spot. And Sean Elliott's team was ready to play. Give him credit. And then another question for Auburn is who's going to play quarterback, right? So Bo Nix entered the year tentatively as their starting quarterback and really was kind of ho-hum, the usual what we've started to feel about Bo Nix in the first 3 games. But in the win against Georgia State, he actually got benched, and the comeback drive was led by TJ Finley, who's a former LSU quarterback himself. So the whispers on the plains now are, is this actually going to be Finley's team, or are they going to give Nix another chance to regain his starting status, or are they going to play both of them? They're leaving Ed Orgeron and company to guess who the quarterback's going to be. The one thing that Orgeron said was he's expecting Finley to play to start, but that he's going to prepare for 2 quarterbacks, which maybe that's Parsons' whole end game, right, is to make LSU prepare for both quarterbacks. And then the last thing I bring up before I hand it over to you, Christopher, I'm wondering your take on Max Johnson and where he stands in the hierarchy of SEC quarterbacks. We began the season saying, hey, Miles Brennan's hurt, and Max Johnson, who's Brad Johnson's son, with very limited experience going into the season, is going to be a significant downgrade. But after 4 games, he's thrown for 1,144 yards, which is 3rd in the SEC, and he's got 15 touchdown passes, which is tied for the league lead with Bryce Young in Alabama. So he's thrown for at least 3 touchdown passes in all 4 games this season. And granted, part of that is probably LSU hasn't run the ball quite the way that they want to, and maybe some of it is about the opponents that they've been playing, but that's a little bit better than we were anticipating, at least from a statistical standpoint. Christopher, does that reflect in the underlying stats as you look at this game to see if LSU can hold serve at home?
In a word, no, I don't think so. Not that Max Johnson is a bad quarterback, but I don't think he's as good as his raw numbers may indicate. I mean, you don't have to look far. Just look at last week's game against Mississippi State, and Johnson threw to wide open receivers on completely blown coverages, touchdowns of 64, 58, and 41 yards. On one of those plays, the Mississippi State cornerbacks just ran into each other on a crossing route, and the guy had nobody within 20 yards of him. So, great play, Max Johnson, for being able to make a throw that you could have made. And the rest of his passes outside, yes, they count. Those 3 long plays count. But you look at the rest of his day against Mississippi State, he was 14 of 24 for 117 yards outside of that. And, I actually looked back as well at his quarterback numbers when he's been pressured and the dropbacks that he's thrown the ball with pressure, dating back to the start of last season. I looked at Pro Football Focus numbers, and he's been slightly below average to the bottom third in all of FBS when he's been pressured. And you also look, it's interesting because you mentioned Miles Brennan. He was 4th in the country last year in passer rating, NFL passer rating when pressured. So it's not like it just has to do with the offense. Max Johnson is not a very good quarterback if you can get pressure on him. So that's very key to Auburn in this game. LSU, I think, will have a tough time scoring if they can prevent Boutte from making big plays. LSU's wide receiver 1, who may be a first-round pick in the NFL this year. And Auburn leads the nation in tackles for loss, which is not great. I know LSU is getting healthier along their offensive line, but they can't run the ball. And a team that leads the nation in tackles for loss against a pretty bad offensive line by SEC standards, not great for Johnson, who isn't great as a passer when he gets a lot of pressure. So we'll see how that goes. On the other side of the ball, honestly, I think people that only saw the score of the Georgia State game late in the 4th quarter with Auburn probably got a wrong impression in the game. You mentioned the injury to Auburn's linebacker. Well, their second best linebacker, Zacoby McClain, had a targeting penalty at the end of the game against Penn State. So they were missing both their top 2 linebackers against Georgia State in the first half. They got McClain back in the second half. Georgia State went from scoring 24 to 0 points in the first and the second half because of that. The big issue for Auburn last week was the red zone on offense. They settled for 5 field goals. Most of them were very short. And, if they scored touchdowns on all 5 of those plays, they got 12 points out of those drives. And, that's 35 points if you score touchdown every drive there. So really it's finishing drives for Auburn that they've got to worry about. And, Auburn's wide receivers, you mentioned they fired their wide receivers coach. They've been awful. I know everybody blames Bo Nix, but, he's got to get help from his offensive line and especially from his receivers. And LSU's defense, at least they're not completely at war with their coach behind the scenes as they were last year, with Bo Pelini. But I think Auburn can at least lean on their running game. The one element that Auburn doesn't have in this matchup is being able to throw the ball with any sort of consistency. So, Nick, who are you betting on in this game?
I've never felt less comfortable making a pick than this one, just because I don't know what to expect from either one of these teams right now. I backed Auburn in back-to-back weeks, and they burned me. Now, give them a little bit of credit in that game at Penn State was a near cover, but they didn't come close to covering that 27 last week. So I'm going to spite bet against them this week and take LSU minus 3.5. There's no real reason other than I'm mad at Auburn right now. And the over-under, give me the under in this game because I don't trust either one of these offenses to be especially efficient. You just talked about how Auburn couldn't convert in the red zone. I think that if you're having trouble with that against Georgia State, you're probably going to have trouble with that against LSU. And just traditionally, this game, it tends to lean low scoring, slugfest, punch them in the mouth type of game. So I'm just going to lean back on history and say we're going under 55.5. What are you thinking?
Yeah, I think the entire handicap comes down to whether LSU can hit some big plays in the passing game. I'm going to say no. Auburn's been great actually at defending explosive passing plays, and they should be able to dominate LSU's offensive line. So for that reason, I'm going to go Auburn plus 3.5, and I'm going to go under 55.5. For Nick Cole, I'm Christopher Smith for the 14, and we'll talk to you next week.